Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you listening. We continue on today with our series examining the book of Daniel. Last time we concluded chapter number 2. So naturally in today's study we will begin chapter number 3. It starts with King Nebuchadnezzar setting up a golden idol for the people to worship. Our reading then is taken from chapter 3 and I shall be reading the first 7 verses. So this is Daniel chapter 3 verses 1 to 7. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This is the word of the Lord. Before we look at the opening 7 verses of chapter 3, let's take a few moments to review what we looked at last time. As I hope that you will remember, we concluded our study of chapter number 2. The second chapter of the book of Daniel begins with the king experiencing a series of troubling or disturbing dreams. Only Daniel from all the wise and learned men in his empire could help. Only Daniel could tell him what his dream entailed, and more importantly, what it all meant. There is, of course, a good reason for this. From among all of the wise men, only Daniel and his friends enjoyed a real relationship with the all-powerful, all-knowing God of the universe. God honoured Daniel's faithfulness by revealing to him the secrets of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel began by outlining in explicit detail what the king had dreamt. In the dream, the king witnessed a terror-inducing statue. The statue, most likely of a powerful warrior figure, was constructed of 5 different materials. Its head was gold, its arms and upper chest were of silver, its belly and thighs were made of bronze, its legs were of iron, and the feet were the rather odd mix of iron and clay. As the king watched, a supernatural stone hit the feet of the statue and eventually destroyed it. The stone then grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Following this explanation of what the dream contained, Daniel went on to interpret what it all meant. Each part or component of the statue represented or symbolized a succeeding empire. The span of time represented by these empires stretched from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, around 600 BC, all the way until the second coming of the Messiah. The golden head of the statue represented the glorious Babylonian Empire, led of course by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. This empire, though vast and glorious, would be conquered and succeeded by the empire of silver, which symbolized the Medo-Persians. They in turn would be overrun by the Greeks, represented by bronze. Their moment in the sun would be eclipsed when the Romans crushed them underfoot with their legs of iron. The feat of iron and clay most likely represents the future revival of the old Roman Empire that will rule the world at the time of the Antichrist. This will be the final Gentile empire in human history. Its brief time of glory will not last long, because the stone that hits and brings the statue down represents the Lord Jesus Christ. He will return at the end of the 7-year tribulation period to smash to pieces this final empire. He will then take his glorious and rightful place as king. The king is greatly impressed by what Daniel has revealed. His response upon hearing this prophecy is to fall on his face before Daniel. This, of course, is the reaction that someone would have if they were encountering a divine being. In the ancient world, one lowered themselves before a superior as a mark or sign of respect. The lower you went, the more it indicated your acknowledgement of them as being of a higher rank or status than you. As I mentioned last week, a king like Nebuchadnezzar would never normally adopt such a posture. Nebuchadnezzar then goes on to make some rather impressive sounding statements about Daniel's God. This God, according to Nebuchadnezzar, was the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. We might read these words and think that Nebuchadnezzar is making a bold profession of faith, that Daniel's revelation has made him realize that Daniel's God is the one true God. However, as we shall shortly discover, this is not the case. Nebuchadnezzar, you see, is merely noting that Daniel's God is a mighty and powerful God. He's not therefore denying the existence of all the other gods in whom he believed, but simply stating that Yahweh deserves a place at the top of his pantheon of gods. Chapter 2 ends by telling us that Daniel was rewarded by the king by being promoted. He was actually given 2 jobs. Firstly, he was made ruler of the capital province of Babylon, and secondly, he was elected president over all of the wise men in Babylon. These, of course, were highly prestigious positions. Daniel, however, didn't become puffed up with pride. He didn't let his promotion go to his head. He also didn't forget about his friends. He petitioned the king on their behalf, and the king, who regarded Daniel highly, also rewarded Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by making them civil servants. They most likely served as assistants to Daniel. Today, then, we start chapter number 3. It begins by telling us that it was not long before Nebuchadnezzar's pride and stubborn rebelliousness resurfaced. His words praising Yahweh proved to be empty and hollow, as he turned from God and began to worship someone that he had far more love and respect for, himself. Before we unpack the fascinating and rather well-known events that occurred in chapter 3, I need to make a few observations about what we are reading. Chapter 2 concluded with Daniel and his friends being given important government posts. So it's quite logical for us to assume, as we start this next chapter, that they have gone off and begun their careers. So naturally and obviously, the events of this chapter are unfolding after an unspecified period of time has elapsed. The big question is, how long a period of time? Are we talking months, a year or 2, or much longer? As with many debates over the timing of events in the Bible, there is considerable disagreement over this issue. Some scholars think that Nebuchadnezzar's erecting of the golden image, the statue, took place within a matter of months, or a year or 2 after Daniel's dream interpretation. This is highly plausible if we regard what is happening here as being some kind of ceremony designed to unify or consolidate the empire. It's something that a king would call for early on in his reign, not usually after many years of being a ruler. Others think that a much longer span of time has passed. The Septuagint translation of verse 1 dates these events to the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, around 587 BC. Others date it to around 585 BC, shortly after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. It's quite common then to hear Bible commentators say that the events of chapter 3 took place at around 18 to 20 years after the dream was explained. I think that good arguments can be made for either position. I am, however, rather inclined to think, for reasons that we shall see later, that what we are reading about in chapter 3 happened within a matter of months, or perhaps a year or 2 following the dream interpretation. Well, with that introduction complete, Let's begin and dive into chapter number 3. Verse number 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. We learn here then about the actions of King Nebuchadnezzar, taken some time after the events of chapter number 2. For reasons that are not expressly given, he decides to erect a large golden image. Let me first address the image itself, and then I will speculate a little on why exactly the king might have made such an image. What did this golden image or statue look like? The Bible, sadly, does not give us a description. Scholars have proposed 4 main theories as to what it might have been. But let's look at each in turn. An obelisk. This image, as we can determine from the dimensions that we are given, was tall and thin. This may indicate that it was actually an obelisk. An obelisk is a 4-sided column with a pyramidion on top. They're still commonly observed today. I'm sure that you've all seen pictures of the Washington Monument, or the Luxor obelisk that stands in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. A famous obelisk also stands in front of the Vatican. Obelisks were a popular focus for pagan worship in the ancient world. Many existed in Egypt, and King Nebuchadnezzar may have been inspired from having seen them personally, or after having heard about them. The obelisk was often linked with deities associated with the sun. Think, for example, of the Egyptian sun god Ra. He was also worshipped in Babylon. They were also associated with sex and fertility. An obelisk is, after all, a phallic symbol. It is purposefully designed to resemble an erect penis. So this image that Nebuchadnezzar constructed may indeed have been a golden obelisk. A human-animal hybrid statue. The image may have been a statue depicting a human and animal hybrid. Now to us today, such a thing sounds very strange. The notion of being half human and half beast is just pure fantasy. But many don't find the idea of transhumanism all that shocking. The idea of combining human beings with technological advancement would have been just as shocking or surprising to ancient people. So in the ancient world, the notion of creatures that were part man and part animal was widely accepted. One only has to look at ancient Egyptian culture to see this. They had, for example, Bastet, a woman's body topped off with a cat's head, Sobek, who had a crocodile's head and a man's body, and Anubis, who had a jackal's head and a man's body. Archaeologists have discovered Babylonian image of a similar type. So this image that Nebuchadnezzar constructed may have been an animal or a hybrid of some kind. A Babylonian deity. Was the image a representation of one of Babylon's numerous gods? The god Marduk or Bel would be a strong candidate. He was, after all, the national god of the Babylonians. King Nebuchadnezzar held Nabu to be his own patron god. In addition to Marduk and Nabu, there were at least 7 other major deities that were highly regarded and who received regular worship in Babylon. So it's quite possible that the image was a statue or a representation of one of these gods. A representation of King Nebuchadnezzar himself. The final, and I think the most likely possibility, is that the image was designed as a representation of Nebuchadnezzar himself. The proportions of the statue would make a human figure a little bit distorted. This is because the normal physical proportions of the human body is actually 5:1, but Nebuchadnezzar's image height and width would be closer to 10:1. So if it were a human figure, it would have had to have been a very long and slender person, or else have had distorted proportions. But this, however, was not that unusual for statuary at this time. Alternatively, it might have been a human figure standing on top of a tall column. For reasons that will later become apparent, I think that the golden image was intended to represent the king. Well, let's turn now to consider the kind of material that was used. We are told that the image was made of gold. The historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon almost a century after the time of Nebuchadnezzar, describes seeing a solid gold statue standing at 5 meters tall. But this image that Nebuchadnezzar constructs is much bigger. It makes it, I think, unlikely that it would have been made of solid gold. It would, after all, have taken a huge amount of gold to make a solid statue of this size. And we must also consider whether the weight of such a solid gold structure could be supported on such a narrow foundation. It was therefore probably a wooden skeletal frame covered by a thin coating of gold plate. It would still have been a very impressive spectacle, glittering as it would have done in the sun. It's also interesting for us to think of this large man-made idol being essentially hollow. How true that is of any worship that does not have Jesus Christ at its centre. Any devotional worship of things made or designed by men is empty and ultimately unfulfilling. I'm going to come back to this point in my closing thoughts. How large was this image or statue? The dimensions are given by Daniel as being 60 cubits high by 6 cubits wide. A cubit, remember, is a measurement based on the length of the forearm from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. It's usually equal to about 18 inches or 46 centimetres. So this statue was an impressive 28 metres tall and 3 metres wide. To give you some idea of how large and impressive such a statue might have appeared, I have a couple of contemporary examples. This bronze statue of an Amazonian female warrior was constructed in Benin in 2022. It stands at a height of 30 metres. The famous statue of Christ the Redeemer overlooks the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. The statue stands on an 8-metre high base or plinth. The actual statue's height is 30 metres. So this gives you some indication of just how tall and impressive Nebuchadnezzar's image would have been. Just a note in passing about the numbers that Daniel gives us. Why do you suppose Daniel mentions the exact dimensions of the statue? Is there some significance to these numbers? Numbers in the Bible, of course, often, but not always hold a special meaning. You will note here the recurring sixes. What does the number 6 represent? The number 6 is often associated with mankind, imperfection, human weakness, evil, and the devil. 6 then is the number of man. Man's system on earth is made up of 3 parts: economic, religious, and governmental, all of which are influenced and led by Satan. This then is exactly what we are seeing here in the construction of this image. Nebuchadnezzar is giving in to frailty, weakness, and sin in elevating himself, man, above God. The final thing that we read here relates to where this statue was located. We are told that Nebuchadnezzar set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The expression Dura is a rather common name in Mesopotamia and simply refers to any place which is enclosed by a wall, or, depending on the context, it may refer to a fortification of some kind. This rather vague term means that we are not really sure where exactly this statue was erected. However, a potential site has been put forward. It lies about 6 miles from the ancient remains of the city of Babylon, and consists of a large 14-metre square base of bricks, which would have ideally served as a base for such an image. Wherever the statue was located, we can be assured of the effect or the impact that it had. It would have been visible for many miles in every direction, and it no doubt, as it was intended, struck people with a certain degree of awe and fear. Before moving on, let me touch briefly upon why Nebuchadnezzar might have wanted to set up such an image. The Bible does not tell us why he did this, which allows us a little room in which to speculate. I'm going to propose 2 possible reasons. The first centres around national unity. Did the king set up this image to serve as a rallying point for national cohesion? This fits nicely with the idea that these events took place within a relatively short time after his dream. He was still a relatively new king at this point, and his empire had expanded greatly. There were still the rumblings of uprisings and rebellions. He therefore wanted all of the different people groups and culture groups to unite in their loyalty around him. So was the image designed to give people a central focus point? Was it intended to act as a kind of glue that held the empire together? The second reason may be one of pride, vanity, or even open defiance. We know that these were qualities that this man had in abundance. Again, this theory fits well with the recent revelation that Daniel has given the king. Daniel had told the king that he was the head of gold. Did this news motivate the king to create an all-gold image of himself? Are we to see this then as an act of pride? Or is it the construction of this image serving as a visual act of defiance or rebellion against what Daniel, God of course, has revealed? Nebuchadnezzar is not content to be merely the head of gold. He wants to be all gold. He is not content to have a limited empire in terms of its scale and longevity. He wants one that will extend throughout all of history. He will not therefore bow the knee and accept what the one true God of the universe has revealed. Well, let us continue. Verses 2 and 3. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So once the image is ready and established, the king sends out invitations to a whole host of government officials. I put the word invitations in inverted commas back there. This was an invitation that you were unable to refuse. Simply put, it was a command for anyone who was important or who held a government post to come to the site of the statue. Let me briefly touch upon the job titles given. Satraps were Nebuchadnezzar's chief representatives over a given region or geographic location. As I've told you before, the vast empire of the Babylonians was divided into provinces, each of which would be governed by a satrap. In terms of power and authority, only the king was more powerful than the satraps. The administrators were men in charge of the military forces in a given province. They served under the command of the satraps. The governors were one step lower down on the hierarchy, and most likely managed smaller regions within the larger province. The councillors were lawyers or guardians of the law. Treasurers were responsible for the public finances. The judges administrated the law, and finally magistrates pronounced sentences on violators of the law. So as I said before, this comprehensive list includes anyone who served Nebuchadnezzar in an official capacity. Daniel is at great pains to highlight who set up this golden image. He drives home the point repeatedly that it was Nebuchadnezzar who set it up. This repetition is intended, I think, to remind his readers that this was a wholly man-centered thing that was happening. This was Nebuchadnezzar's idea, and he was the one bringing this about for his own prideful and selfish human ends. You cannot help but notice the unnecessary and rather tiresome repetition that Daniel uses here. All of the rulers and later the musical instruments are repeated, but actually I think he uses it for a particular reason. It serves, I think, as a useful literary device. Daniel is using it to underline the excessive bureaucracy that typified the Babylonian Empire. All of these rulers and leaders then are to come to the plain of Dura for the dedication of this image. As with many state-ordered gatherings, This was designed to emphasize the ruler's power and authority. It was intended to symbolize the supremacy of Babylon and its king. It was also designed, I believe, as a test of loyalty to the monarch. If you refused to come and pay proper homage, it marked you out as being disloyal and a potential traitor. Well, let's see what was to happen when all of the people gathered together before this golden image. Verses 4 and 5. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." A herald in the ancient world served something of the same kind of role as a modern broadcaster or spokesman might today. In England we refer to heralds as town criers. They would quite literally go around the towns and villages shouting out news, announcements, or important proclamations. The herald here is performing a similar kind of function. He is tasked with telling all those who are gathered that upon a given signal they are to fall down and worship the golden image. This mention of worship, used 11 times throughout the chapter, indicates that this was far more than just a political assembly. This was a religious observation. The signal for the worship service to begin is given through a musical cue. You noticed, I'm sure, that a list of musical instruments was given. Why list them, and not just say, "when you hear the music"? There are at least 2 reasons why they are listed. The first is to highlight to us the importance that music played in the Babylonian culture. They had a great, and at times overriding, passion for music. Nebuchadnezzar then was wise to incorporate instrumental music into this ceremony. This is because he knew that through it he could stir people's emotions and make it easy for him to manipulate them and win their submission and obedience. We will do well to remember that music is a very powerful tool. It has the power to strengthen nationalism, motivate conquest, and inspire people to act for good and for bad. That is why, of course, we continue to use music today at political rallies, important national occasions, and before and after sporting events. Think, for example, how stirring it is to hear your national anthem played during the medal-giving ceremony at the Olympics. Take the music away and the event's impact diminishes dramatically. As the English poet William Congreve wrote, "Music has charms to soothe the savage beast." But equally, music also has the power to release the savage in the beast. The second reason that the instruments are named is that these instruments originated in a variety of geographical places. So they are listed to show how all of these different cultures were now gathered and melded into one. So now we really understand the purpose for this image. It is a symbolic representation of the Babylonian Empire and its political and religious head in King Nebuchadnezzar. All who gather and participate are in effect affirming that Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar rule over the entire Middle East. This is why the address is given to peoples, nations, and languages. It does not make a difference from where you originated. Your ethnic background is irrelevant, as is your language. All that is important is your acknowledgement of this image and what it represents. In falling down, literally prostrating yourself before it, these people are signalling their submission to the king and demonstrating their loyalty to him. What will be the fate of anyone who chooses not to fall before this man-made idol? Well, the next verse tells us. Verse number 6. "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." As we have seen, King Nebuchadnezzar was not a man who did things in half measures. You'll remember from previous studies the way that he dealt with the wise men. If they could not reveal the secret of his dream, they would be chopped into pieces and their houses burned. Later he issued a decree that all of the wise men be arrested and killed. Here, anyone earning the king's displeasure by not following orders and bowing to the image will be thrown into a burning fiery furnace. What exactly was the fiery furnace, and what might it have looked like? Well, it was most probably a type of kiln or oven that was used to create lime or fire bricks. They also used these kilns to fire the metals with which they later made weapons, tools for building and for agriculture. Interestingly, as related to this particular story, such kilns were also used to prepare the precious metals that they would use to make statues. So as you can imagine, these kilns or furnaces played a very important role in the life and development of the Babylonian culture. In terms of its shape and size, it may well have had a domed surface with a funnel or opening at the top in which to insert fuel for the fire. Typically this would have been wood or coal. The ovens were able to generate heat of between 800 to 1300 degrees centigrade. At the bottom of the kiln there would have been a space that enabled you to remove waste and ashes. For centuries in Babylonian culture, being burnt alive had been a traditional punishment for blasphemy. We read the following, written by the prophet Jeremiah. And because of them a curse shall be taken up by all the captivity of Judah, who are in Babylon, saying, The Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. Jeremiah 29:22. Well, let's conclude our study for today by looking at verse number 7. Verse number 7. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 7 tells us what happened when all those gathered on the plain heard the particular musical cue. In unison they fell to the ground and prostrated themselves before the golden image. Such an act from the people should probably not surprise us. Most people become highly compliant when refusal to comply results in death. What was the point of openly showing that you did not submit to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar? There was very little to be gained. Therefore they bowed down to a man. Also we should remember that as pagan polytheists, they were not wedded to the idea of idolatry as we are. We know that the God that we worship is a jealous God. He will not share the honour and glory that is rightfully his with any man-made idol. It is for this reason that we do not worship any other image or idol. But this, of course, was not an issue for these pagans. They would have said, well, what's the big deal with bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar and pretending he's a god, when we already honour and acknowledge a whole panoply of other deities? However, not all of those present fell down and worshipped before the golden image. 3 men refused to put an idol before Yahweh, and their story will be the subject of next week's sermon. Lessons to learn. I have 2 comments to make based on today's passage. Number 1. The hollowness of worship without Christ. We saw in our account today that Nebuchadnezzar constructed a large image or idol of gold. As we noted, it was highly unlikely that this was made of solid gold. It was probably a wooden frame onto which a thin layer of gold was attached. So from an external vantage point, it appeared to be a sturdy, solid gold structure. But inside it was just empty and hollow. There was nothing at its core. It's a wonderful metaphor for all of the man-made religions and worship that grew from our rebellion against God. Human beings throughout history have produced a whole array of systems that are designed to make us holy and righteous. In fact, all of the man-made religions of the world rely on these works-based systems for obtaining salvation. Do this, go there, say this in order to be saved. All of which are ultimately empty and hollow. When those following these systems break through the gold plate covering their idols, there is nothing inside that is solid and real. When they stand before Christ, all of their good works will seem pointless and hollow. Sadly, even in the Christian church, we are not immune from hollow worship practices. Look at the direction that much of the church is taking today. Sermons have become shorter, Bible studies are cancelled or replaced, traditional worship experiences are regarded as being dull and boring. People sadly are drawn to what tickles the ears. Church services in some places have become just like entertainment shows. Worship for many has become empty and hollow. People may feel a temporary emotional lift, but they're not really receiving a true spiritual experience. So let us all be careful. We don't want to be drawn into worship that is ultimately unfulfilling and unrewarding. We don't want worship that has had Christ diminished, or far worse, removed altogether. May he be at the centre of all our worship, now and forever. Number 2. The fiery fate of all those who fail to bow. 2021, Pew Research surveyed Americans on their beliefs about heaven and hell. Of all US adults surveyed, 73% believed in heaven, but only 62% believed in the existence of hell. Interestingly, in the very same survey, 40% of those asked said that even those who do not believe in God can go to heaven. Well, let's set the record straight. According to the Bible, hell is just as real as heaven. In fact, hell is mentioned 167 times in the Bible. Scripture then clearly and explicitly teaches that hell is a real place to which the wicked unbelieving are sent after death. Who goes to hell? Well, hell is the destination for all those who reject the free gift of salvation offered only through the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, by definition, if you don't believe in God, then hell is where you will end up. One of the potent images that the Bible uses to describe hell is as a lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. This is the ultimate consequence of sin, which is to be totally cut off or separated from God. The lake of fire will be a place of perpetual suffering and misery. Scripture indicates that every person whose name is not in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. Many Christians today are deeply uncomfortable with the very idea of hell. I think that they would rather like the whole notion of it to disappear. And I can appreciate in some ways where they are coming from. The thought of people tormented in flames for all of eternity is not a pleasant one. But to deny hell is to deny reality. The reason that the Lord Jesus spoke so frequently on the existence of hell urges us into action. We do not want to go there ourselves, and we do not want our loved ones to go there either. There is then no time to lose. Share the gospel this very day. Remind those that you love of the fiery fate for those who fail to bow.
Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud,
"To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, You shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace.
So, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar,
O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up.
Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king.
Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?
O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up.
Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors,
Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?
True, O king.
Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.
Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke,
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.
Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. And they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke.
Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this.
Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.